The Ozark Mountains of northern Arkansas hold secrets in their hollows and hollers, deep forested valleys where the sunlight struggles to reach the ground and where the soil seems to swallow history whole. In the spring of 1976, Baxter County, Arkansas became the epicenter of a mystery that would haunt this landscape for generations. 13 men vanished. Not over years, not over decades, but in a terrifying 90-day window between March and June. A deputy sheriff, ranchers, truck drivers, businessmen. One by one, they slipped through the cracks of reality, leaving behind empty homes, abandoned vehicles, and grieving families with more questions than answers. The official explanation? Coincidence. A tragic string of bad luck in a rugged county where people sometimes just disappeared. But in the whispers at the general store, in the hushed conversations over coffee at the Mountain Home Diner, everyone knew the truth was darker, more deliberate. This wasn't a mystery. It was an erasure. A silent, bloody war fought in the shadows of the very hills that had nurtured these communities for centuries. The summer of '76 wasn't marked by drought or flood in Baxter County. It was marked by a silence so profound, so unsettling, that to this day, old-timers lower their voices when they speak of it. This is the story of the Dawson County War. Not a conflict between nations or ideologies, but a family's desperate, brutal campaign to reclaim what was stolen from them. A story of what happens when the social contract shatters, when the institutions meant to protect you become the very threat you must survive. This is what happens when justice isn't found in a courtroom, but at the end of a rope, in the trunk of a car, at the bottom of a lake. 42 years later, in September of 2018, the ghosts of that summer stirred once more. A documentary team rolled into Mountain Home, population 12,000, a town caught between its pastoral past and an uncertain future. Producer Lena Hayes, a 35-year-old with a decade of true crime documentaries under her belt, saw this as more than a story. She saw it as a historical excavation. Her partner, Ben Carter, a cinematographer whose lens had captured everything from war zones to Wall Street, was drawn by the moral complexity. They were chasing a tip from a man who was, in every meaningful way, already a ghost. Garland Moss, a retired Arkansas State Police investigator who had spent 30 years circling this case like a planet around a dark star. He'd retired in 2015, but retirement hadn't brought peace, only the relentless pull of an unsolved truth. His initial email to Lena's production company was a masterpiece of intrigue. There is a story in Mountain Home that was buried in 1976. 13 men disappeared. The investigation was not just stalled, it was actively strangled from within. I know who put them in the ground. I know where the bodies sleep. But I am 78 years old. If this is not documented now, it dies with me, and 13 families are condemned to eternal wondering. Lena and Ben met Moss at a roadside diner outside Harrison. Over lukewarm coffee, he laid out a map of disappearances that formed a chilling pattern centered on Baxter County. He spoke not with the dry recitation of a cop, but with the haunted urgency of a man who had carried a terrible weight for too long. He handed them a file, not an official one, but a personal dossier compiled over decades, filled with names, dates, connections, and a central, looming family, the Dawsons. To understand what happened in the summer of 1976, you must first understand the Dawson family. They weren't just ranchers, they were an institution. Their roots in Baxter County reached back to the 1890s, when Walter Dawson's grandfather, seeking refuge from a rapidly industrializing world, loaded a wagon and headed for the isolation of the Ozarks. He found it on 2,400 acres of unforgiving, beautiful hill country east of Mountain Home. It was land that demanded everything and gave back just enough to survive. Through sheer grit, that survival blossomed into a legacy. By 1976, that legacy was stewarded by Walter Dawson, 65 years old, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun, wind, and loss. His wife, Eleanor, had died suddenly of a stroke 8 years prior, leaving Walter to raise their 4 sons alone. He instilled in them the old Ozark values: self-reliance, deep family loyalty, and a profound distrust of any authority that originated beyond their own fence line. The sons were Jacob, the eldest at 40, pragmatic and steady; Micah, 37, the most physically imposing; Silas, 34, observant and quiet to the point of eeriness; and Jonah, the youngest at 31, sharp and restless. All 4 worked the family operation, living in houses scattered across the vast property. They were married to local women, raising children who would, in theory, inherit this hard-won kingdom. In the community, they were respected but never quite embraced. They were known as hard men, not cruel but unyielding. The kind of men who fixed their own fences, healed their own animals, and handled their own problems. Their wealth wasn't in cash, but in the land and the herd that roamed it, approximately 800 head of mixed-breed cattle, the product of generations of selective breeding for hardiness. In early 1976, that herd represented nearly $500,000 in value, a fortune in rural Arkansas. It was the family's bank, its retirement fund, its entire identity. And then, in late February, the count came up short. Not by 2 or 3, but by 32 prime animals. Vanished from winter pastures as if they'd never existed. Walter Dawson did what any law-abiding citizen would do. He called the Baxter County Sheriff's Office. The man who took the report was Sheriff Wade Preston, elected 2 years prior on a platform of cleaning up corruption. Preston was charismatic, a former high school football star who knew how to work a room. He sent a deputy, Carl Finch, out to the Dawson property. Finch walked the pastures, shrugged, and filed a report that would soon be buried in a cabinet. No evidence, no leads. Case effectively closed. For the Dawsons, this wasn't just incompetence, it was a betrayal. The law they paid taxes to support had looked at the theft of their life's work and offered a bureaucratic shrug. But Walter Dawson was a student of human nature and of his own land. He knew cattle. He knew the difference between animals that had wandered off and animals that had been expertly cut out and driven away. This was a professional job. He called a family meeting at the massive oak table in the main farmhouse, a table scarred by decades of Dawson life. 32 head, Walter said, his voice deceptively calm. Someone's been on our land. Someone with trucks, with planning, with a place to take them. The sons argued strategy. Jonah, fiery, wanted immediate action. Jacob, cautious, suggested giving the sheriff more time. Silas, the watcher, simply listened. It was Micah who voiced the growing suspicion. What if the sheriff's department isn't just slow? What if they're looking the other way on purpose? This question changed everything. It moved the theft from a criminal act to a systemic conspiracy. The Dawsons decided to run a parallel investigation. Theirs would be based not on procedure, but on knowledge of the land, of the cattle trade, of the intricate web of relationships that bound their community. Silas, with his preternatural patience, began surveilling a likely outlet, a meat processing plant outside nearby Gasville, owned by a man named Harlan Bigsby. For 3 weeks, Silas Dawson became a ghost on the back roads around Bigsby's quality meats. He saw legitimate ranchers dropping off animals by day, but by night he saw a different pattern. Unmarked trucks with mud-smeared plates arriving after midnight, men who moved with the tense efficiency of those doing something they shouldn't. And then, the confirmation. One night, he saw a Baxter County sheriff's cruiser pull up. Deputy Carl Finch, the same man who had filed their useless report, stepped out, went inside, and emerged 10 minutes later tucking a thick envelope into his jacket. When Silas reported this to the family, the room went cold. The enemy wasn't just a faceless rustler. The enemy had a badge. Walter Dawson's investigation expanded. Jacob cultivated sources in the county's cattle circles, hearing whispers of other ranchers, the Jessops, the Sheltons, the Mears, who had suffered similar unexplained losses over the previous years. All their reports had gone to the same dead end at the sheriff's office. A picture emerged of a sophisticated, protected operation. Harlan Bigsby's plant was the hub. Deputy Carl Finch was the security apparatus, providing advance warning of any law enforcement interest and ensuring reports were buried. And Sheriff Wade Preston? He was almost certainly the silent partner, the architect who provided the blanket of official immunity. The Dawsons had mapped a criminal enterprise that was, for all intents and purposes, a subsidiary of the Baxter County government. They were left with a devastating choice: accept their loss and the failure of the system, or take matters into their own hands. Walter gathered his sons once more. Insurance money can replace cattle, he said, his eyes scanning each of his boys. It cannot replace generations of bloodline. It cannot replace the principle that a man's property is sacred. The law has shown us its true face. We will not go to them again. We will handle this, ourselves, permanently. The decision was unanimous. They were no longer victims. They were declaring war. Their first target was not chosen at random. He was a known weak link. Leo Gantz, a 47-year-old drifter with no family who did the dirty, hands-on work of rustling for Bigsby. He lived in a decaying trailer on rented land outside the hamlet of Midway. On a rainy April night, Jacob and Micah Dawson knocked on his flimsy door. When Gantz opened it, bleary-eyed from drink, they didn't brandish weapons immediately. Jacob asked a single, quiet question. "You the one who took cattle from the Dawson place in February?" The panic that flashed across Gantz's face was all the confession they needed. They forced their way in. What followed was not a frenzied killing, but a grim, methodical interrogation. They needed information, and fear is a powerful motivator. Gantz, realizing his life was measured in minutes, talked. He named names. fellow rustlers Nelson Reed and the Pike brothers. He described routes, meeting points, the process of moving stolen stock to Bigsby's plant under cover of darkness. He confirmed Deputy Finch's role as the lookout and payoff man. And when Jacob pressed, "What about the sheriff?" Gans stammered, "Finch handles him. But there's no way he don't know. No way." When his usefulness expired, so did Leo Gans. They used his own rope. They buried him before dawn in a remote, thickly wooded hollow on the back of the Dawson property, a place so forgotten even hunters avoided it. One down. For the Dawson brothers, there was no celebration, no horror. In later years, Jacob would describe it to Garland Moss as a necessary chore, like putting down a rabid animal. The line had been crossed. There was no walking back. 4 nights later, they took Nelson Reed, using a ruse of a shady cattle deal to lure him to an isolated spot. The pattern repeated: interrogation, confirmation, disposal. 2 down. But these men were criminals, drifters. Their disappearances caused ripples, not waves, within Bigsby's organization. For their campaign to have real impact, they needed to strike at the protection racket itself. They needed Deputy Carl Finch. Finch was a harder target, a family man, a public figure. They tracked him for 2 weeks, learning his routines. They discovered his solitary weekend fishing trips to a cabin on Bull Shoals Lake. On a Saturday in late April, while Finch was out on the water, they entered his cabin and waited. He returned at noon, hauling a cooler of fish, utterly unaware. When he saw Walter Dawson standing in his living room, with Jacob and Micah flanking him with rifles, his hand flew to his service weapon, then froze. "Deputy Finch," Walter said, "you helped steal my cattle. I want to know everything. And I want to know Sheriff Preston's cut." Finch, a practical man at his core, saw no exit. He talked, and he revealed the stunning scale of the operation. It had been running for 3 years, had stolen from over 40 families across 3 counties, and was netting over $1 million. Sheriff Wade Preston's cut was 25% of every dollar. He was not just complicit, he was the CEO. Killing a deputy presented a unique problem. His disappearance would trigger a massive search. So, they improvised. They weighted Finch's body with chains and cinder blocks and sank him in a deep, cold channel of Bull Shoals Lake, famous for its treacherous currents. They set his fishing boat adrift. 2 days later, it was found empty. The official investigation concluded, a tragic drowning, body unrecovered. 3 down. The Baxter County Sheriff's Department had just lost one of its own to the very silence it had helped cultivate. The spring of 1976 became a season of ghosts in Baxter County. The Dawson brothers, operating with the cold precision of a military unit, worked down their list. Roy Osgood, a trucker who moved the stolen cattle, vanished from a Highway 62 rest stop. Harold Stacy, the forger who created fake bills of sale, disappeared from his home in Yellville. The Pite brothers, Merle and Donnie, were intercepted while actually moving a load of stolen stock. Each encounter followed the same chilling protocol: isolation, interrogation to gather more intelligence, then execution. The bodies were dispersed, some in the Dawson Hollow, some in abandoned mine shafts that dotted the hills, others in the lake. They created no pattern, left no central dump site. They were learning, adapting. As Garland Moss would later tell the documentary team, they weren't just killing, They were dismantling an organization. Each death was a strategic strike. Panic began to shred Bigsby's operation from within. Men quit. Others fled the state, believing a rival criminal outfit or a vengeful family was hunting them. The Dawsons' war of attrition was working. By late May, they were ready for the head of the snake, Harlan Biggs Bigsby himself. Bigsby, sensing the net tightening, tried to go legitimate, but it was too late. The Dawsons learned of a trip he was taking to meet buyers in Oklahoma. They planned an interception that would look like misfortune. On a winding, isolated stretch of Oklahoma back road, they blocked his car. The questioning of Bigsby was the most comprehensive yet. He was the brain of the operation, and he knew where all the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking. He confirmed in damning detail Sheriff Preston's central role. "It was his idea," Bigsby pleaded. "He came to me. He gets 25%. The records are in a safe deposit box in Harrison." The Dawsons weren't interested in records for a court case. They were interested in confirmation. They staged a single vehicle accident so convincing, a crashed car, fire damage, skid marks, that the Oklahoma Highway Patrol ruled it a tragic accident without a second thought. 8 down. The core of the criminal enterprise was now dead. But the Dawsons' war had created a deadly backlash. Sheriff Wade Preston was not a fool. He saw his network evaporating. He knew he was likely next. Instead of running, he decided to fight fire with fire. Using connections from his corrupt years, he contacted a fixer in Little Rock named Gerald Holcomb, who in turn hired a contract killer from Pulaski County. The killer's fatal mistake was being too thorough. He asked questions at a Mountain Home feed store, unaware the owner was a cousin of the Dawsons. The warning reached the family. A stranger was scouting them, asking about routines, about dogs, about how many men lived on the property. The dynamic flipped instantly. The Dawsons were now both hunter and prey. They found the assassin at a cheap motel. He gave them Holcomb's name before joining his would-be victims in an abandoned mine shaft. 9 down. Jonah and Micah drove to Little Rock. They cornered the fixer, Gerald Holcomb, and offered a trade. His life for his records. Holcomb, a survivor, gave them everything: ledgers, contracts, bank records, and the damning contract for their own murders, signed off by Sheriff Wade Preston. With this insurance, they eliminated Holcomb and anonymously mailed the records to the Arkansas Attorney General. Preston's fate was now sealed from 2 directions. The final 3 targets, a fleeing trucker, a rustler hiding in Texas, and finally Sheriff Preston himself, were dealt with by the end of June. Preston was caught trying to flee the county. The Dawsons took him to the original hollow. Walter's final words to the man who embodied their betrayal were stark. "You wore the badge. You chose to be a leech. We're just the medicine." On June 29, 1976, Sheriff Wade Preston vanished from the face of the earth. 13 down. The disappearance of a sitting sheriff triggered the investigation that should have happened months earlier. State police, the FBI, roads were blockaded, lakes dragged. And then the bombshell from the Attorney General's office landed. The Holcomb records, painting Preston as the kingpin of a massive theft ring. The narrative flipped overnight. The search for a victim became the exposé of a criminal. His corrupt deputies were indicted. The Dawson family? They were interviewed, of course, but they were polite helpful victims who had quietly rebuilt their herd. They had no obvious motive, no evidence against them, and the community, knowing what Preston and his men had been, collectively decided to look the other way. Rough justice had been served. The case of the 13 missing men was never solved, officially. But in the hills of Baxter County, everyone knew, and no one spoke. The silence held for over 4 decades. Garland Moss, the retired investigator, finally got his confession in 2017, not in an interrogation room, but in a memory care facility in Harrison. The last surviving Dawson brother, Jacob, was in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's, but in a rare, cruel window of lucidity, he unburdened his soul to Moss, whom he mistook for an old friend. He named all 13. He described the graves, the methods, the reasons. He spoke for 3 hours. When Lena and Ben's documentary crew found Jacob Dawson in 2018, that window had slammed shut forever. He stared vacantly, a man whose mind had become a locked vault at the bottom of the sea. He died in 2019. The Dawson Ranch has since been sold. New cattle graze over the hollow. Garland Moss passed away in 2021. The case files in Mountain Home remain in the cabinet, stamped unsolved. So what are we left with? Not justice as society defines it. No one stood trial. No one was held accountable in a court of law. We are left with a stark parable about the fragility of civilization. The Dawson family were not born monsters. They were pillars of their community, churchgoers, family men. But when the system sworn to protect them became the very entity preying upon them, they made a choice. They chose a darker, older code, and they lived with that choice for the rest of their lives, carrying a secret that transformed their legacy into something ambiguous, tragic, and terrifying. The Ozarks keep their secrets. The hills absorb the blood and the stories. And somewhere in the deep soil and the cold water, 13 ghosts remain, a permanent stain on the land and a permanent question for us all. What do you do when the law is the lawbreaker? Where do you turn when the social contract is torn up before your eyes? The Dawson County War offers no easy answers, only a chilling glimpse into the human capacity for retribution when all other doors slam shut. This story forces us to confront difficult questions about justice, vengeance, and the line between them. If you found yourself in the Dawson family's impossible position, what choice would you make? Could you take the law into your own hands, or would you wait for a system that had already failed you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you're fascinated by these deep dives into true stories from the real underworld, where history, crime, and human nature collide, please support our channel. Hit the like button, subscribe to @TheRealUnderworld12, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that challenges everything you think you know about justice. Thank you for watching.